Anyways, let's talk about first what this meeting is about, and what our agenda is, and what we want to walk away with. So I just thought I made a quick screen here. Is everybody seeing this? Okay, so what the meeting is about. So number one, Marc Laredo is going to unpack the issue for us a little bit, what it is. Then we're going to talk about what are options. You saw the letter that was written, and there's some of the signers of that letter here tonight. And they're going to talk about what they see. We can talk about a couple of other creative options that have come up, what's likely to come up for the council. And then all this in advance of the meeting Monday night. So if people would like to speak on Monday night at the public hearing, then you want to do so cogently and effectively. So hopefully this meeting will help you do that. One thing, okay, what this meeting is not. So this is not the public hearing. So we're not going to get into, you know, the morality of guns and you know, for guns, against guns, all that. That's not this debate. This is really about what the issue is that this council has, and that public meeting is the time to have, whether it's ethical or not, or those things. Here we don't have to quite do all of that. So
there's no screen sharing. We're just going to hear it.
So hopefully you just saw the screen there. Okay. So I mean, I just made a crummy little text screen so you could see it. But anyways, I did want to, so without further ado, Marc, are you here? I saw Marc.
I am, Chris, and ready whenever you want me to start.
Sure, why don't you start right now?
Great. Well, thank you all, and thank you for inviting me this evening. I think as many of you know, my name is Marc Laredo. I'm a councilor at large from Ward 7. And what I'd like to do this evening is just give you a brief overview of how we got to where we are now, what is going forward in the city council, and what perhaps some alternatives are. And I have to, at the outset, say a couple of things. One, because this is a matter pending before the council, I want to be factual about what I say, but I want to be very careful to reserve my personal advocacy for when my colleagues and I are in the city council chambers, virtually, of course, so that we do not do anything that in any way would run afoul of the open meeting law. I don't see other councilors on the call, so I don't think we have those concerns as much, but nevertheless, I want to be circumspect. Second, and this is important, this is an unusual issue.
He doesn't know what GUNS is.
This is an unusual issue in that there's a lot of interplay between the law department and what we as a council may or may not do. And there's a fair amount of interplay in terms of legal advice that we're getting. And as I think many of you know, legal advice that we get, particularly as in potentially contemplating litigation, is confidential. And so I want to be very careful that I don't say anything, and I think at the public hearing that we don't say anything that would essentially discuss or reveal what may be a legal strategy, depending on what happens in a particular situation. So with that kind of broad overview, let me just explain briefly how we got to where we are now and what we're going to do going forward. Apparently back in January, an individual filed an application with the chief of police for a gun permit. To open up a gun store, excuse me, or a gun shop, however you want to refer to it. That went through the process at the police department. I don't, you know, the mayor's put out a statement, I think, about when she learned of things and so forth. This is not something that the city council knew, but this is really something that's probably was not, at least in the city council's bailiwick, at least to begin with. The point is that the application was made. Apparently an application was approved. The person started on the process to open up the gun store on Washington Street, which is right near Garden Remedies in Ward 2. And it came to light and the public began to learn in early to mid-April that in fact this was there. And of course that then started a tremendous public outcry, which I think anybody who's been following this issue is well aware of. We have received dozens and dozens and dozens of emails and other communications on the issue. It's important to separate out the current application from what we do with zoning going forward. The current application is out there. My understanding is, and this is just my understanding, that a building permit has not been issued for the project. And that therefore, if we enact a zoning regulation, that can in turn affect this particular project. Now that is a legal interpretation. It could be challenged in a court of law. I'm not going to opine what the outcome of that is going to be. So I think it's really important that all of us understand that we have an application out there. What happens to that application may or may not be dependent on what the council does in terms of enacting an ordinance. But that's where we are. And when all this came to light, it became apparent to us that we did not have anything in our city ordinances that governed firearms sales and gun stores or firing ranges or anything of the like. Turns out we're not alone. Apparently Wellesley's discovered the same thing right in the aftermath of our situation. And my understanding was in years past, and in fact, were gun stores in the city. So that's the landscape of where we are today. And what has since happened is that the entire city council and the mayor have docketed an item. And docketing an item is a process in the city council whereby we start the process for enacting essentially an ordinance or legislation to regulate the gun stores in the city. The ordinance, the docket item was deliberately written broadly. And the reason for that is if it's written broadly, you can then modify and change it along the way. If you write it too narrowly and you try to expand it later on in scope, you may have to renotice a hearing and start your process again. So there was a deliberate process that was worked upon by city council leadership, the mayor's office, the law department to craft a broad docket item. We had an initial meeting of the city council's zoning and planning committee. And even though I'm not on that, I attended, as did many of my colleagues. And the short of that is that we are in the process of trying to craft language that will regulate the sale, the location of gun stores in the city. Now, here's where it gets really tricky. Because we run up against constitutional law issues that may limit our, and I use the word may, and I do that deliberately, may limit our ability to regulate, at least to some limit in some degree, our ability to regulate stores. So we are obviously being closely advised by the law department. I think that the law department is trying to reach out to as many experts as it can in this area, because this frankly is not the type of thing that our city law department does on a regular basis. They're really do a wonderful job helping us craft ordinary zoning regulations, having us interpret land use issues, helping us with an array of other things. But this really deals with constitutional appellate law issues as to the ability to regulate the location of gun stores in the city. So what's going to happen next is we are going to do several things. One, we're going to have a public hearing on Monday night, and you're all welcome to attend. I will just give you my personal views on public hearings. Maybe former Alderman Stewart has a different view, but I really urge you, if you're going to speak, to keep your remarks short, to the point, and try, if you can, to say something a little different if you've heard the same thing said 5 or 6 times previously. I'd urge you not to just repeat it. I will also say, judging by the sentiment on the council that I heard at our last hearing, that there is huge, if not unanimous, support on the council. And again, I want to be careful that I don't presume anything, but the tenor of our discussion is clear that there is a strong will to regulate the location of gun stores in the city. So if you get up and want to just speak generally about your dislike of gun stores, I think, candidly, I think we get it. The harder question for us, and the one that we're going to grapple with, and is to what degree we can regulate them. And if the regulation is in place, should it be determinative factors, how near they are to a school, public or private, how near they are to residential areas, how near they are to village centers or away from village centers. Those are all things that we're going to have to wrestle with as a council. I know David Bunis is going to speak in a few moments. And I know David well, and he's one of the signatories on a letter that I think many of you saw from a group of really prominent lawyers in the city, many of whom I think have a lot of expertise in these types of issues. I don't want to either steal David's thunder or preempt what he's going to say, but I think they have a certain view of what we can regulate and what we can't regulate. And that, frankly, is going to be the issue that we have to grapple with as a council. And I think it's no secret, the broader the regulation is, whatever that may be, I think it's more likely that we are going to face some kind of legal challenge of some sort to the regulation. And so what we're going to have to do, I think, as a council is be guided by our law department, which we must. They're our legal advisors. Hopefully the law department in turn is guided by some of these folks like David and others who've got a depth of expertise here. And then try to craft a language in an ordinance that's broad, but is going to withstand challenge. And one of the things that we as a city need to grapple with, and you're our constituents, so you have to give us some guidance here, is, if we think we're on difficult ground, we take a very aggressive position in terms of what we can do. Is that a place where the city thinks our residents think we should spend our time, money, energy, and what are the downsides if we do not prevail in that kind of a dispute? So those are all the factors that we are grappling with. I expect after Monday night's public hearing, which I think will be very well attended, we're going to have a lot of speakers as my guess. I know the chair may try to start doing some actual crafting on Monday night. If not, my understanding is there's a special meeting scheduled for Thursday night of next week, where we really have to grapple with what we put in an ordinance. And so, again, the support for the ordinance is there very clearly. The challenge for us is what we can permissibly and legally do. And again, some of what we say publicly may have to be a little circumspect, because we have to be careful about, we don't want to make the argument if someone's going to challenge it. We don't want to necessarily make the argument for them. So that's where we are. And we as a council will, again, with your input as residents of the city, how broad should we be? Should we take risk in terms of if we make a particularly broad ordinance, what is likely or not likely to happen if it gets challenged, and what's the downside if it does? So Chris, I think that's where we are now, and I'm happy to take any questions if people have them about any of the process piece.
Well, let's continue on here. Folks, I got a call from Joe Kennedy a little while ago saying that he had been asked to attend a vigil for, I guess, an associate of his that had been killed. So he just had to make it about face. He did, however, want to say something, and so he sent along his statement here, and I'll just read it while you read along. If there's anything the experience of living in America has taught us, it's that increased access to guns has profound consequences. It should be well within the right of any community to reasonably limit the availability of weapons that have time and again shattered our families. That is all Newton residents seek to do here, to exercise our right to regulate an industry that comes with significant risks to our kids, families, and neighborhoods. I urge the council to move expeditiously on the new zoning rules and block a gun store from opening within a mile of 6 schools and countless homes and small businesses. So that's his statement there. And I'm sure, you know, I'd be willing to bet most people on the call share that same sentiment. But what we'd like to do here is move straight to the letter. And David, as one of the signers of that, maybe you want to walk us through it. Would that be good?
Terrific. Thanks, Chris. And thanks, Mark, and everybody else who turned out for this meeting tonight. Unbelievable, 51 people on a evening like this says a lot about how important this issue is for our city. So, Chris, thanks for inviting me.
You can't log in?
I can.
Can we mute?
Let me mute that. Yeah.
I don't have any record of your being logged in.
There we go. All right.
All right, we're good?
Yeah.
We're good. So thanks for inviting me to speak. Let me just say from the outset, my name is David Bunis. I've lived in Newton for more than 25 years. My 3 kids went through the Newton Public Schools, Ward School, Bigelow, and Newton North. That's my black lab, Ruby, in the background. She's lived here a long time too. And I've practiced law for more than 35 years and argued cases in state and federal courts in Massachusetts and around the country, including constitutional cases that have some of the issues similar to what we're going to talk about tonight. I'm also proud to be one of the signers of the letter that went to the mayor and the city council. And in case you all didn't recognize the names on the letters, it's really not me, but it's an all-star cast of some of the really most talented, accomplished, experienced lawyers that live in Newton and who are standing by and ready to lend their expertise to help Newton with this really important cause. So in a minute, I'm going to talk a little bit about the law, but I just really wanted to start off with, you know, sort of plain speaking common sense about the way we all ought to think about this and the way our elected officials ought to think about it. And that is, we should just start off by doing what we feel is the right thing to do. And my sense is that the overwhelming majority of Newton residents, my friends, all of you, feel that a gun store in Newton would pose a threat to our safety. And it's great to hear from Marc tonight that our elected officials seem to feel the same way. And that there is a way to go about doing this that will keep us safe and withstand a legal challenge if there is one. So I just wanted to speak plainly at first about our values and doing the right thing. The second thing I just want to talk about is that it's possible to draft what I call a smart ordinance that it has a very good chance of withstanding a legal challenge. And a smart ordinance would not ban the gun store outright. That's sort of a blunt instrument. It's been tried and it has failed in cases around the country, including the Chicago case, which I'll talk about in a minute. Instead, a smart ordinance would impose sort of common sense restrictions that would protect the city, and while at the same time not imposing an undue burden on the Second Amendment to right to buy guns. So the question is, how do you go about doing that? What does a smart ordinance look like? Well, fortunately, there is a playbook for how to do this. And other cities and towns around the country, just like Newton, have faced very similar challenges. Here's the playbook. It's setting restrictions, all sorts of restrictions, like hours of operation, buffer zones from homes and schools and houses of worship, restriction on ownership and licensure, and mandatory disclosures about the owners and investors, including mandatory criminal background checks, and passing fire safety rules and building code restrictions, and strict rules for the safe storage of ammunition and gunpowder. All of those restrictions under ordinances around the country are subject to review and approval by the city or the city council. So another thing we got to do is we got to learn from cities and counties around the country that have already done exactly what we're trying to do and have won cases in court. Let me just give you a couple of examples. So there's a 2017 case coming out of Alameda, California, where the county enacted an ordinance which prohibits firearm sales within 500 feet of residentially zoned districts. At 500 feet of residences, schools, daycare centers, other firearm retailers, and liquor stores. These types of restrictions are sort of grouped together. They're called sensitive area restrictions. And when a gun shop filed a permit or requested a permit, the county denied the request for the permit. And then the county
I had a
was
long
sued.
talk with Jim this afternoon.
The county was sued.
And you haven't run across
Really mute, Scott, thanks. The county was sued, and the trial court and a federal appeals court both ruled in favor of the county and against the gun store. And the Court of Appeals clearly ruled that the plaintiffs, the ones who wanted to open the gun store, had no Second Amendment right to sell firearms. And the court also ruled that the county's ordinance did not infringe on individual gun owners' right to buy guns. And one quote from the case is, quote, "Gun buyers have no right to have a gun store in a particular location." The second lesson I think we can learn is a 2018 lesson from Piscataway, New Jersey. And in that city, the town passed an ordinance that set a 1,000-foot buffer zone within, and it said prohibited within 1,000 feet of sensitive areas, which were defined as schools, parks, churches, synagogues, healthcare facilities, and other sensitive locations. And I'll just note that 3 years have gone by and the ordinance hasn't been challenged in court. I know there's some concern in the law department about a 2014 case out of Chicago. And the folks who with me wrote the letter to the mayor and the city council feel that that case is easily distinguishable. And really the most distinguishing feature of that case is that that case used a blunt instrument. It involved an outright ban on gun stores. And it also banned firing ranges anywhere in the city. Now, the first point is obviously Newton is different from Chicago. And we wouldn't take that approach, and we're not advising that the city take that approach. Instead, a more surgical approach, not a blanket prohibition, but surgical restrictions is the most likely way to have our ordinance withstand scrutiny. A couple more points. One, don't be afraid of the gun lobby. The NRA right now is under siege. It's the weakest it's ever been. And there's an army of lawyers in Newton, in Boston, in Massachusetts, New England, and throughout the country who were standing by to help the city draft a smart ordinance and defend it in court. And there's just a couple of resources that are standing by ready for us. Not only the lawyers who signed the letter, but since the letter came out, I've personally gotten several emails from lawyers in large firms in Boston who say, just tell us where to go. We're ready to help defend the city. Many of you have heard of the Gabby Giffords Gun Center, Center for Gun Safety. And I was just looking at their website this afternoon as I was thinking about what I was going to say tonight. And here's just a quote from the website. It says, "Our attorneys have crafted model laws to serve as the foundation for state or local lawmakers to draft legislation to fit the needs of their communities. Get in touch with us to see how we can help you. We're standing by." And then the Brady Gun Safety Center, named for President Reagan's aide, the quote on their website in the same section says, quote, "We have the strongest legal team in the country to challenge and change laws state by state, city by city, and nationwide," right? So there is an army out there that's standing by and ready to help us. So I'll close by just saying that I think some things are worth fighting for. And in my view, and I hope in yours, and Mark, it was glad to hear that the city council likely feels the same way, that this is something that's worth fighting for. And I think all of us need to call on our elected officials, show up at the meeting on Monday, and call on the officials not only to do the right thing generally, but to reach out for help and to do everything possible to protect us from gun violence, and doing it in a smart way that begins with passing what I call a smart, comprehensive gun ordinance that protects Newton, doesn't impose an undue burden on gun owners, and has a strong chance of surviving a legal challenge. So Chris, that's a few remarks. I'd be happy to answer questions or do whatever you want to do to carry on, but that's on behalf of the group that sent the letter.
If you and Mark can stick around, then what I'd like to do next, first of all, are there any other signers of the letter that are here tonight? David, you probably recognize them more quickly than I would. That would like to voice something else. Otherwise, I would say, okay, I know that there are several counselors. I don't think there are any city councilors here with us other than Mark. Several city area councilors wanted to voice some opinions. And really we can just get started with that. And then I think, we don't have to be formal about this, but if you want to ask questions to David and Mark or whoever at this point, or during your time on the floor, please feel free to do so. So with that, I think I'm going to start with Carolyn because I know she wanted to speak. If you're ready, Carolyn Bay.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you to our presenters. And just to be brief, I came tonight prepared also to advocate against the movement that I'm hearing about to seek a ban, because in addition to what our two presenters have talked about, I'm quite concerned when I read Alameda, which was not an outright ban. It was I'll call it extreme zoning, smart zoning case. I'm quite concerned that that case did go up to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is California. And then it was applied for Supreme Court review. And the Supreme Court in that case declined to review it, leaving the California Ninth Circuit decision intact, standing and prevailing. While I think the First Circuit in which we are located would probably be similar to the Ninth Circuit's viewpoints on these things, I am now, without undue fear of the gun lobby, quite concerned about the very different makeup of the Supreme Court we face today. And I don't want a gun shop in Newton, but I also don't want Newton to end up setting precedent under a Supreme Court that I do not have faith in to continue to uphold gun restrictions in the same way that prior courts did. So I don't want to trust the fate of the country on this kind of an issue and set precedent with Justice Kavanaugh and now Amy Coney Barrett tipping the majority in a direction that I suspect would be not what the old court did. And the court is about, in any event, to take up a Second Amendment case and perhaps come down with a pretty scary ruling. So I'm going to add a voice of caution, again, to what our prior speakers said about worrying about the downsides of litigation. I'm not worried about the costs. I'm not worried about the time it would take. I'm worried about losing, setting a precedent that would be unfortunate for other communities. I'm concerned about Wellesley doing the same thing because they are apparently contemplating an outright ban. And I think, as Mr. Bunis said, we need to be smart, surgical, and effective. And that's the end of my comments. Thank you very much.
Can I briefly respond, Chris, or?
Of course.
Carolyn, I think you make really excellent points. And I just want to, add to what David said. I think he is completely spot on. And David's a pretty modest guy, but I'm a lawyer, and David's a very talented lawyer, as are many of the other signers here of that letter. These are really, and so what the city needs, what we need to do, and I think it's very, very helpful to us to have a group of folks who are going to step up and help us craft the language. Because as Carolyn said, the challenge here is to get this right, to have a strong ordinance, but one that is going to be crafted in such a way that if it does get challenged, it's going to prevail. And again, the challenges could be at multiple levels: a district court, and a court of appeals, potentially the Supreme Court. So that's a real challenge for us. Where we as counselors need to hear from you as residents is, just like Carolyn said, I'm in favor of doing this. I'm in favor of you spending the money. It's okay to do that. We also need to hear that as well, because after all, even with the volunteer services of many lawyers, it is time and money of the city. We're spending your money and the time of your employees. And so if folks reaffirm how important that is, I personally think that's valuable, in addition to how we specifically craft the language. But David may have some more specific comments.
Chris, can I just briefly respond? And Carolyn, I really appreciate your insight and your comment. I have two thoughts. I have two thoughts. One is we shouldn't be afraid of losing. If you don't pass a strong, smart ordinance now, you're guaranteed to lose, right? So the question is, do you want to trade losing immediately for the chance that you'll lose later? And I don't think we'd lose later. And when I talked earlier about the playbook, lawyers around the country who were taking on these sorts of fights are learning a lot from our conservative friends who have had a lot of success before Justice Kavanaugh and other conservative judges. And one of the ways they've done it is by using the playbook that's been used to try to shut down abortion clinics. And I'll just read you something that I just read from from an article this afternoon, from a law review article. One legal expert suggested that the New Jersey ordinance is a progressive version of targeted regulations on abortion providers, also known as trap laws, common in deeply conservative states. Those laws don't ban abortion per se, but they do place burdensome conditions on facilities that perform the procedure, making it impossible for many clinics to remain in operation. And so there are smart ways to craft laws. And if conservative judges are going to rule in favor of Second Amendment rights, and they're inclined to also want to uphold these restrictions on abortion clinics, they can't have it both ways. And so it's possible to craft smart laws that'll appeal to conservative judges.
Oh, that's interesting. That's how this is going to play out will be obviously what everybody here is interested in. And one of the things I have been hearing from people is, Newton is all about the schools. The number one reason people move to Newton is the schools. So our children are what we've invested in here. And so people are pretty darn scared about this. Now that we're having, shooter drills at the schools and things, this new reality is pretty tough to swallow. And so the flag that goes up when you talk about putting a gun shop in the mix is obviously of concern to everyone here. Got a number of hands here from some of the counselors of both our councils. Waban hasn't weighed in here, so Counselor Tom Elkind wants to speak. So Tom, if you want to weigh in now.
Thank you, Chris. Like David and Mark, I am a former litigator in Boston. And one thing I never did was to guarantee a client that they were going to win any case. I get scared when I hear people say, go spend all this money, you'll win. It just, my nature is to be skeptical of comments like that. I'm a great supporter of gun laws that restrict the ability to for people to obtain guns. So I'm certainly very inclined to have anything we can do to restrict that. But one of the things that I like to do whenever I'm faced with a problem like this is to try to think about what arguments the other side would make. And I think one of the ways, and I'm certainly not an expert in this area of the law, so I won't pretend to do that here, but one of the things that comes to mind here is for all of us who are opposed to people having guns, my guess is most of us are in favor of preserving the right to abortion. So if whatever ordinance we pass in Newton, we would feel comfortable exchanging the word gun store for abortion clinic, I think you'd have a very good chance of that passing muster. So the other thought that I have on this is I am not inclined to see the city become the subject of a Supreme Court case on this issue and to spend the money that would take. So if the city is inclined to take a very strict, hardline position on the issue, I'd like to see, before the council votes on this, certain law firms step up and agree to take the case and all the expenses of the case on a pro bono basis.
That's a good idea, to figure that out. There's a couple others that also want to chime in. I did want to say that it might be of value for us to talk about what kind of options might the city council consider. As I mean, like, one might be an outright ban, no gun stores in Newton. Another one might be, okay, we're going to limit where it can go. In which case, what would that look like? Does that mean, like, somewhere up in Upper Falls, somewhere in Chestnut Hill, somewhere in Waban? I don't know. What might that look like? And Mark, do you have a sense of what that would look like?
Chris, I want to be really, I'm sorry to be.
You can't talk about it.
I'm sorry to be cautious here, but I really want to be careful about it. I think David, raises and did raise in his presentation the types of restrictions that you probably permissibly can put in. Hours of operation is a relatively easy one, it seems to me, so long as you didn't, make it for 1 hour a week. But any, not allowing a store to open late or close early or not be open on a Sunday, for example, we routinely do that for all sorts of other businesses in the city. That seems to me a relatively easy restriction that I think at least would probably pass muster. A distance from a school, for example, some distance, we do that with other types of stores as well. Marijuana is a good example. There are limitations on how close that can be to a school. Other restrictions, I just think you need to be more careful. I do think, Tom, your comment about getting law firms to agree in advance that they would do this work pro bono. My sense is that there are a lot of people out there, as David said, who would do that. But certainly that's something we as a council need to be aware of. So I leave it at that. I mean, I think these are all good suggestions. I think our challenge will be, and where we can best hear from you is, guided by things that David and his group are saying about what is permissible, and if there are any trade-offs involved there, what trade-offs residents of the city would like to see. Do we want to write an ordinance that effectively limits a gun store at most to a very small area in one or two parts of the city? That too has pros and cons. It limits it, but it makes it somewhat preordained that any store is going to go into a certain location. So those are, I think, things that we have to think about.
Interesting. Kartiki, I think you wanted to weigh in on this.
So thank you all, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. So first of all, Marc, I have one question for you. And the question is, as you identified some of the options, is there an option to, we call it as a, applicability, but not feasibility? So, just to little bit give you a background, I am a deputy COO for Mass Health. So many of the times the policies in healthcare is as vague as you can be. And many a times, it's been lobbied in different ways. So we have to deal with the policy. So operationally, what we do it is we implement policy in a way that it's applicable, but it's not feasible in a practical sense, because that situation could never be a feasibility arrive. Is there a potential of something like that into this one as well, where we are saying by law, hey, we are not saying no to you, but the way it is written in a way that practically you're not going to find a place to do it?
I prefer that David respond to that question if he could, because I think that's something that he's got some, obviously put a lot of thought in, some expertise, and I want to be careful about how I respond to that. David, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I'm understanding your question to be something like, if the city were to give a vague response to the application for a permit to have a firearm store in Newton, would that somehow be better than a more specific denial? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that, if I'm the next in line, right? Not this one, but if I'm next in line as a gun shop owner, I may come to you and I see the ordinance and I read through the information and I want to apply for all, I can follow all the process. But in a practicality, I will not find a place to even open up a gun shop because, well, there are many other challenges to open up a gun shop.
Yeah, and one really interesting aspect of the Alameda case in California was that the plaintiff in that case was the second gun shop to apply. There was already an existing gun shop in the county, and the ordinance that had been passed had a prohibition of 1,000 feet from another gun shop. And if you apply the 1,000-foot buffer to the existing gun shop, that's a way to avoid a second gun shop.
So I think that I'm just trying to propose that, is that could be a value, because even though you say you can go to one or two places, but giving that option of one or two places also creates an entry point for someone else in the future.
Yeah.
So if we come, here is my thinking is, if I want to avoid it, if I can avoid it by all means to everything, that's the best ideal situation for us. If we cannot avoid it, what's the limited loss we can have? And in the limited loss model is, if I lose this, what do I do so that nothing else can happen around it, so that I save everything else going forward? And then I come back to the one that is sitting in my backyard to see how can I get rid of it eventually. Just a thought.
Yeah, that's you're talking about a second gun shop. wait a minute. How did we
No,
get?
I think, you have to think for the future, because,
Right, I know, I
kind-
understand his point about, you can zone in a way that will, create buffers, right? And
And-
that's the angle for that. And I think that's really the angle that they're looking for initially. Buffers from schools, buffers from liquor stores. I don't know what you can put in there, but
And one more thing I wanted to add to it is, I know that we talked about the cost, and it's only me, and maybe this is how I think, and maybe I do not have full understanding of it. So please bear with my lack of knowledge. Aren't we in a litigation for Webster Woods, where we are spending close to good sum of money on lawyers with BC?
We are in litigation with Webster Woods. That is litigation that's costing the city money. Potentially, this type of litigation could be potentially very expensive. Webster Woods is about a defined issue, how much the city should pay Boston College for Webster Woods, what's the fair market value of the land. A matter like this potentially could be more far-reaching. But on the other hand, is far more likely to attract an array of very talented lawyers who want to help the city litigate it, because there's a strong public interest and support in the community for this. So I think we have the ability to call upon a tremendous amount of talent that lives right here in Newton to help us out with defending whatever we pass. And I'm pretty confident that we have that capability. Really good capability.
We are fortunate to have a lot of smart people around us to help us out. My point of identifying the Webster Wood was that, it's a prioritization. If we are looking on a budget point of view, if I have X dollars as a budget, and if I need to manage it, at one end, I'm trying to, go for a massive expense of litigation for a piece of land. And on the other hand, I'm trying to contemplate, should I be spending money on the safety of the people residing here? So, can I take away some of the litigation costs from the piece of land? Because people's safety, what matters the most over the land. That it's me.
I think we're in the midst of the litigation for the land already, so I don't think that's going to change. But I think your greater point is how do we spend our city resources? I mean, that's really what you're asking, and I think
Exactly.
That's a very fair and appropriate question. And as I said earlier, I think that's one of the issues we need to hear from you. If the residents of this city say, yes, this is a place we ought to spend our time and money, that, at least to me, and I think to my colleagues, is very important information, because if we do pass a very strong ordinance and we do get challenged for it, we want to know that we're carrying out the collective will of our residents, that this is how we ought to be spending our time, money, and energy.
right, this is a
Yes, but
fight.
I don't think we should be juxtaposing Webster Woods laws with this. Let's leave Webster Woods out of it. I think Marc's looking for specific feedback about whether we want to spend resources and so forth on the gun shop. I think it's a red herring to worry about Webster Woods.
I'd like to interject here for a minute. Nelson and I moved into Newton in 1970 now? 72. And we have lived through the existence of 2 gun stores. We were not afraid to walk down the streets. We were not attacked by anybody with a gun. I know that there is a lot of interest in keeping guns away from people and away from people who are mentally ill, and regulating who can have them and how they can be used. But fear of a gun store is a bit irrational. Now, I'd like to talk about what it would cost us were we to go ahead with a ban, which I think, as Carolyn and others have said tonight, is foolish. We would be tilting at windmills. It would be a quixotic event, because it would cost us not just the money for the litigation. And believe me, it would be expensive, because as our lawyers who are suggesting they would give of their time would definitely do so up to a point. But if this were to be buoyed up to the Supreme Court, and well, it might be, we would find the taxpayers of Newton spending money that we don't have at the moment, given what we've had to spend on COVID and what needs to be done in our city, including projects like Webster Woods, which I think is relevant because they are the things that keep Newton a wonderful place to live. We spend money on our schools, and we must continue to do so and to improve them. What we haven't looked at or talked about is the cost beyond money if we ban this gun store. We will have protests here in Newton. Our lives will be turned upside down. We will become an epicenter of agitation. We will have people pro and con marching down Center Street. Don't think that I'm making it up. The Massachusetts chapters of GOAL, the Gun Owner Action League, that we refer to as a lobby, but it is also considered a Second Amendment rights advocate group. They know about what's going on in Newton. They're well aware of it, and they speak to the national chapters, and they speak to the NRA. And if you think the NRA is poorly funded at the moment, just raise this issue to the Supreme Court, and you will see the coffers filled, because the country that we live in is not completely Massachusetts. The country we live in is made up of 50 states with many, many varied opinions on the Second Amendment. We would be beyond foolish to ban this particular gun shop. We would be within our rights to figure out a way to allow this gun shop, if it were interested in coming into this city still, or another gun shop, to do so in a way that would be regulated, would be safe, and would keep us from the fear that we seem to be hearing, that, believe me, the people in Waltham don't have, and they have a gun store. The people in Dedham will be living, or are living at this point, with a gun store. The people to the west of us in Framingham have a gun store. You're not afraid to go to the Natick Mall because there's a gun store nearby. You can live with it if you regulate it carefully and are sane about the whole thing. Thank you.
Well, I certainly understand your approach of sanity towards the whole thing. And indeed, maybe it's not something to fear as much as what the initial knee-jerk reaction is to. And what has been suggested from Marc and some of the others is that regulating it in such a fashion that it hems it into a tolerable position is an option, and the city council will look at that. I'm just going to say, though, I would not fear litigation in this. I mean, you can say, you know, it's not me who's in charge of the budget, but it's not you either. And I think that given how important children are in this community, Newton, and schools, and how that's a really serious fear. It's like, you know, the availability of guns is proportionate to the actions we've seen that have ended lives. So, you know, it's just something we want to be careful with. And I understand why people are up in arms about this. I know you do too. Now, my co-captain, Peter Bruce, is patiently waiting to weigh in. By the way, I just want to let people know, Carolyn is also an attorney. We heard from, we had a slew of attorneys until afterwards. Now we're listening to some of the area councilors. So Peter Bruce is the president of the Newtonville Area Council, and you have the floor, Peter.
Thanks, Chris. And Speaking of lawyers and area counselors, I'm going to try to actually speak for a lawyer. Ironically, Peter Harrington wasn't able to be here. He had another meeting, and he wanted me to throw four of his ideas into the mix. They're quite brief. For people who don't know Peter, he's a former longtime Newton alderman, a former state representative, and he's currently practicing land use law in Newton. So here are his concerns that are especially directed at the idea of including gun stores in manufacturing districts. First, manufacturing districts weren't designed for retail sales. They were intended for other purposes. And adding a retail component doesn't conform to the standards intended for the creation of zoning use districts. Second, 13 of the 16 manufacturing districts that were suggested in the early draft locate potential gun shops in wards 1, 2, 3, and 4. This overbalance on the north side of Newton is likely to create unnecessary opposition. Third, the draft ordinance that we've seen so far is a reasonable attempt, in his opinion, to control gun sales in Newton. They're both U.S. and Massachusetts constitutional issues that have to be considered if the legislation is to be effective. And like many others who've spoken already, he's very strongly insists that we should support a law that will survive an appeal. Fourth, an overwhelming majority of voters, in his opinion, will support gun control measures, but they won't support a ban. So those are his views, and thank you very much.
Interesting. Yeah, Peter's always had wise things to say. Indeed, he cautioned us about waking the giant of the NRA. That there's many ways to handle this kind of thing, and one is loud and the other is not. And but I'm just paraphrasing all of this. Rena Getz is the vice president of the Waban area council. She's basically been waiting to have the floor. Go for it, please, Rena.
David, I really appreciate your coming and speaking, and I would like to take a moment to ask you a few questions. Can we use a proximity rule? Can we limit the number of stores based on the Alameda case? Are we allowed to put in place a restriction on the number of stores as well as put in place a proximity rule?
So I appreciate the question. And what I can say is that in the Alameda case itself, one of the criteria that was used, one of the many restrictions that was exercised in the zoning ordinance that was passed, was a buffer from other gun stores. And so it turned out that when you look at the map, as I said, there were existing gun stores in the county. This was an application in the Alameda case for a new gun store that was seeking a new permit. Mm-hmm. And the way the county drew the ordinance, it did make it nearly impossible for a new gun store to open up in the county. And the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled 9-2, so overwhelmingly, in favor of upholding the Alameda ordinance. So an ordinance that that prohibited new gun stores from opening passed constitutional muster. And I've just had one other thing, which is that the availability of nearby gun shops is a factor in the analysis of trying to figure out whether the ordinance does or doesn't impose an undue burden on the constitutional right to buy a firearm. And I haven't done the measuring myself, but there are nearby gun stores in Waltham and in Dedham and other nearby locations. I actually did a query on the ATF website this afternoon, and I found licensed firearms dealers that were not associated with sort of known gun stores, but they're within a mile or two of Newton. And so I think that all of that might come out. And if it turns out that gun owners or those interested in purchasing a firearm have options nearby, that makes it more likely that a Newton ordinance with a buffer would withstand constitutional scrutiny. No guarantees, but more likely.
Yeah, well, I very much appreciate your coming and speaking tonight. And I think that all of us welcome you as well as your co-signers to vociferously, weigh in. Because I think that our counselors are going to, very much consider your thoughts in crafting the ordinance. So thank you. Thank you very much.
David, if you could clarify, what kind of sales, gun sales is, I mean, if it's not a store, you were just referring to sort of another kind of form of gun purchasing agents or whatever? What is that?
I just, I can't say exactly, but one of the ways that in order to sell firearms, you need to have a license to do so. And the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms keeps track of all of those individuals and entities who have applied for and been granted licenses to sell firearms. And you can query the database on their website. And I did that. And I just selected Massachusetts, and it lists the name, address, and phone number by zip code of every licensed firearms dealer in the Commonwealth. And if you sort the Excel spreadsheet by zip code, it's easy to come up with the list of licensed firearms dealers that are within a certain given distance of Newton.
Wow, so is this somebody I would like call somebody up and say, I want a Glock 9mm handgun or something? It's
possible.
So this is already there.
Yep.
That's already in existence. So I actually didn't know that. So interesting.
I'm not so sure, Chris, that it is for retail sale. A private person can be a gun dealer because they want to have something shipped to them and they want to be able to sell it privately to another person who would have a gun dealer license or to a gun store. Okay, there are different reasons. It's not the same as a gun shop where you would go in. You would have to, before you could purchase anything, have your firearms card. You would have to, before you could purchase anything, show that you've been trained in the use of firearms. Massachusetts has regulations that are rational. I don't agree with any groups that say that we are over-regulated. I think we are rationally regulated and we could be somewhat more regulated. So I am not a gun nut, in case you thought I was. I just recognize that we have people who think in different frameworks from how we do. Sure. And I think when you're talking about a gun shop, a retail gun shop, it's very different from having the name of a private person who is a gun dealer. That is not something I know for certain, but I would check into that before I make that argument.
Yeah, obviously it is. I mean, I walked into LL Bean up in Maine the other day. They had a busload of guns there that you could buy, and like,
Dick's used to sell guns. Walmart.
Yeah. So
Walmart, yeah.
You know, so I guess. Anyways, from Newtonville, Councilor Archer's had her hands up. So Jessica, if you want to weigh in.
Sure. Sorry, I'm still at work. And I work in a healthcare facility, so I can't have my camera on. So in general, in terms of, querying databases and mapping, it's luckily we have really good geographic information systems data in Massachusetts that the state has. We have some of the best in the nation, and the city also has their own department. So in terms of boundaries and representing those, I think sometimes, it's a little hard for people to visualize different scenarios in what would be acceptable in terms of a buffer area. But that's something that anybody who wants to say, if it's within a certain, if all these single bans are put into place on, XYZ factors, this is what it would look like. This is where we can limit it. So it's great that we have the option to not only use words, but also visuals and ways to be able to describe that. People had some concerns about being, within obviously schools, domestic violence, shelters, and many other, places where people congregate, like parks. So unfortunately, then where does that leave, and will that be equitable for the whole city? I don't know. I'd have to actually see it in every single scenario, but luckily you can get this data online. Anybody can really do it, and you can even do it in a very easy open source mapping program. So if anybody's interested in doing that and seeing that, then it's something I'm happy to work on, or I can help somebody else work on, or it's something we can request the city to do.
I have a question for David, if I may.
Sure.
First of all, thank you for all the information you brought today. I'm sorry that I'm arguing somewhat on the other side of your framework. But I have a question about whether it would make sense to say one store could be allowed, say, on the north side of the city, and one store allowed on the south side of the city, so that our city would feel that we were not favoring either side. And if there were places available, whether it's 5 places on the north side and 7 places on the south side, or reversed, once one of those was filled up, that would be it for that part of the city. Would that be something that would pass the smell test?
I'm not sure well, David, go ahead.
I'm not sure who's doing the smelling.
The Supreme Court.
Right.
Okay, and not the Ninth Circuit, but the Supreme
I don't think
here.
You could pass a zoning ordinance that said one store on the north side and one store on the south side. That would not be appropriate. What you'd have to do is write criteria that would be applied uniformly. Now, it may be that the result of those criteria is that there are 3 locations on the south side, what's considered the south side of the city, and 1 in the north, or the other way around. But you can't, you have to say criteria. What I also don't know is whether we can limit the number per se of stores. I'd want to know more about that. We, for example, with marijuana now have to issue up to 8. We have to do that. That's the way the state law is crafted, because it's based on the number of liquor store licenses that we have.
And I would, Mark, I would just add to that I think that a restriction that limited gun stores in Newton to a set number, like 1 in the north and 1 in the south, would probably be most likely interpreted as a ban, because it's saying 2 and no more, and that's a ban. And so sort of smartly crafted restrictions and conditions don't look like bans, and they aren't applied like bans. And I think that they'd have more likelihood of withstanding legal scrutiny than a limitation of 1 in the north and 1 in the south.
I'd agree with that. And the difference between marijuana is there's no constitutional right under our US Constitution to have a marijuana store. There is a Second Amendment that we have to be cognizant of.
I am hearing, of course, what you said a little bit earlier about the availability of guns purchasable from some of our sister cities around here, so that there is that availability. So there's not a cutoff because of this, and that would figure into legislation that we might be considering. So to what you were saying, Sally, is that we're not cutting off availability, and we don't want to have the backfire that David just mentioned by saying 1 up here, 1 there, and you effectively have turned on the ban, which will maybe backfire more. Anyways, Jane France is a longtime educator, and she wanted to chime in.
Yes, David, thank you very much for your all the information that you provided for us. I had a question. I've been thinking a lot about these restrictions. And obviously, as a school teacher in Newton, I'm very concerned about the schools, but I'm also extremely concerned about the whole city. We have, and I'm wondering if something, if we were to impose significant restrictions around a certain area. I forget what the term that you use, not safety areas, the
sensitive areas.
Thank you, the sensitive areas, so that we would have fairly large sensitive areas. We have bus routes and we have walking routes around each of the schools. At the city council meeting on the 26th, a number of the counselors mentioned concerns about not having gun stores on walking routes. Would that be something that might be, that would encompass a significant part of the city? Is that something that you feel might pass muster?
No, it's an interesting idea. It's the kind of thing that I would defer to the judgment and experience, excuse me, of some of the lawyers who have been doing this work exclusively for the past decade. And they've looked at every ordinance that's been tried in every city and town and county in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I had to phone a friend, I'd call the Brady Center right now and I'd say, hey, have you guys, excuse me, litigated any walking path cases? And they might have experience with that. But it sounds like an interesting idea to me, because it does seem if there are seniors and vulnerable people like kids who are using the walking paths, then that may be a rationale for extending the buffer zone beyond the physical location of a school or a synagogue or a healthcare center to sort of the pathways that surround those areas. So I like the idea, but I'd want to phone a friend and find out if there's experience defending those sorts of things in court.
Great, thank you. One thing that to add to it is that it would provide equity throughout the city if we were to take such an approach. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
I think we have about 10 minutes left in our meeting tonight, but so if people have some more questions for anyone, please raise your hand. You can do that by the little reactions button on the bottom there. Otherwise, I think we're getting close. We've gone over quite a few of the options that Newton will have, and certainly a lot of considerations to be thought of. Sally, you brought up some very important ideas. I think that yin yang on this thing and understanding the pros and cons, and not to be fearful in any direction. I think if this is a case that Newton wants to stand on, and there's some national organizations that want to jump in because they know that it could bring on national furor from the NRA or whoever else. Like it was said earlier, let's find out who will help us on that. But maybe a gun shop that's well regulated in a certain part of town maybe isn't something to be afraid of either. But I'm not making that judgment. You are. Carolyn, you had your hand raised. You got to unmute. I have to unmute you.
I'm sorry, it's successful. I think I just turned off my video, sorry. Jessica, I want to put on the table for David and others to think about a particular conundrum regarding shelters for domestic violence victims, and just ask that people look into that in particular, because as we all know, the whole essence of a safe house is that nobody knows where it is except the police. And so it's going to be particularly difficult to provide for a buffer that doesn't allow a domestic violence perpetrator to triangulate on the safe house. So I just want to, if you're querying these excellent resources, ask you to include that in the list. Thank you.
Great point. Thank you. That's a good point.
Jane, you wanted to jump back in, or you still you had your hand up? Did you, okay, well, the hand up, okay. Well, so let me ask you in closing then, what do you think is the best action for, what are the points you'd like people to talk about at the public hearing?
Are you asking me that, Chris, or the counselors?
Well, I think actually I should ask David that because you can't really respond to that. But what let me see if let me take a crack at it because what I've heard and I've been trying to pay attention. But one is that, do we have the stomach for this? If we have to go to litigation, Mark, you asked, does the city of Newton citizenry, how far to the mat are we willing to go for this? And that's just a question, right? I mean, I'm sure many people here would say like to the very, bottom of that mat, because this is a very dear and horrifying topic in many ways. So yeah, I mean, personally, I'd be in favor of going to the mat on this. I'm not living the rest of my life in fear of anything. So, litigation, again, it's not my bank account paying for that. But like you said, the Gabby Giffords people, the Brady people, and all the signers of that letter. I mean, there's a lot of people, and Carolyn, there's all kinds. We got some legal beagles here that are willing to put up a fight for this because they see what's at stake. So I think, one, yes, we have the stomach for it. Two, a little bit what Sally was saying is that we're not afraid of this so much. If it's regulated properly and handled properly, maybe. I'm not, I think my preference is that all guns would go away. But the reality is you got to deal with them. So maybe there's a way of dealing with that, and I'll let you figure that out. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing was, what's that third thing? But the third thing would
Chris, I don't know what the third thing is, but I would really caution you, as Carolyn did earlier. We have an extremely conservative United States Supreme Court. And a case like this, if we were to enable a ban, would go that far. That is the divisiveness that exists in our world today.
Well,
it would be challenged, and yes, it would cost us money. Yes, there would be marching in the streets. Yes, you could go to the mat on it.
I'd be surprised if there's marching in the streets.
Given the judiciary today, you would be risking losing big time. So my sense is that
it's not a reason to go to the fight.
No, it's not. Don't give it up, Chris. Don't give it up. Regulate. Yeah. But don't ban it. I would say that's not something that we should go there and talk about, a ban. We should talk about reasonable restrictions.
Your opinion has been we hear you loud and clear. And I'm just saying, there's obviously a lot of people who just say would favor a ban entirely. Then there's a lot of people who would favor what you just said, finding that a balance or something. People like David will come forward for that, and we'll see. Maybe the last comment we have from is the head of the Hemlock Gorge people, my partner there, John Mortis.
Okay, so forgive me, I'm a physician and not a lawyer, but I tend to.
You got to apologize for that.
I tend to focus on what's achievable and practicable. So I will just say that I will preface what I say by saying that I am mostly in favor of the repeal of the Second Amendment. Having said that, I do have great sympathy for the opinions that have been expressed by Sally and by Carolyn, because I don't want to be accused of being a Don Quixote and all of this. I went to Google. You don't have to do fancy stuff to find out where you can buy a gun. I just went to Google and Googled gun shops near me, and I have a nice map of all of them, including the one in Framingham that is still open this evening. So yes, go ahead for regulation, but please don't get caught up in the idea that we are going to be able to achieve what has not been achieved in at least in my experience anywhere else, which is something that goes beyond reasonable regulation, because I think that would be a chimerical and costly fight that would distract us from more pressing issues. That's all.
All right, well, do you want any closing statements, Mark or David?
No, I'm just gonna, again, urge all of you to communicate your voices, whatever your opinions are to us. I say it repeatedly, but public opinion, public communication does matter a great deal. And I just want to make a pitch also to thank David and the others in his group for stepping up and advocating as they have. It's been and continues to be incredibly helpful and educational. And so I think we should all appreciate a great deal of the work they're doing. So thank you very much, Chris and others, for having me this evening.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, David. Thank you everyone that came tonight and took a little time out of their evening to discuss this important issue. And both the Newtonville and Waban area councils will be having their regular meetings next Thursday at 7:30 or 7:30.